and welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Today, we're going to learn about the 1992 movie called Chaplin. That movie is a biographical film directed by Richard Attenborough, and it stars Robert Downey Jr. as an iconic star of early Hollywood, Charlie Chaplin. The movie tells the story of Charlie Chaplin's rise to fame in Hollywood during the silent era, his co-founding United Artists, and becoming one of the world's most popular celebrities, as well as the controversies that caused Chaplin's sudden fall from grace in Hollywood. If you're a fan of classic Hollywood, you'll love today's episode. And as a fan of classic Hollywood, I'm sure you're already familiar with today's guest. Scott Eyman is a classic film historian and Pulitzer Prize finalist who has written a number of books about people from Hollywood's history, such as Cary Grant, A Brilliant Disguise, John Wayne, The Life and Legend, and You Must Remember This, a New York Times best-selling book that he wrote with actor Robert Wagner. Scott Eyman's 17th book is called Charlie Chaplin versus America, When Art, Sex, and Politics Collided, and it's available right now. You can find a link to it in the description for this episode. I'm excited to chat with Scott about the life of Charlie Chaplin that we saw in the movie. But before we get Scott on the line, it's time to set up our game, Two Truths and a Lie. Now, if you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'm going to give you three things. Two of them are true, and that means one of them is a lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number one, Charlie Chaplin was very nervous about money, even when he was wealthy. Number two, Charlie's most famous character, the tramp, was the result of years of careful planning. Number three, Charlie Chaplin never became an American citizen. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to identify which one is the lie. Then, of course, we'll do a recap at the end of the episode to see how well you did. All right, now it's time to connect with Scott Eyman about the historical accuracy of Chaplin. Before we dive into some of the details of the movie, if you were to give 1992's Chaplin a letter grade for its historical accuracy, what would it get?
C plus, B minus.
C plus, B minus?
Yeah,
Okay.
It's not a complete fantasia, but it's not terribly factual in a lot of details because, well, his problem, Richard Attenborough, the director, it was one of his passion projects. His problem was that he committed himself psychologically and emotionally to telling the whole story from childhood to basically senescence. And Chaplin lived 88 years. So how do you get an 88-year lifespan into 2 hours and 20 minutes? It can't be done. You know, you're going to be skipping and jumping around. The way to do a biography of an important world figure, it seems to me, is the Lawrence of Arabia idea. You take 3 or 4 or 5 crucial years, you focus on those crucial years, and you try to intuit psychologically where they come from and where they're going at the end of them. And it seems to me that's the best way to do it. But Attenborough, it was his movie. He made his choice, and he wanted to do the whole warping. Correctly, he believed that the key to Chaplin's character was his childhood, which is very true, because Chaplin had a childhood of utter chaos and deprivation and want, essentially, psychological, and at times emotional, and certainly physical. There was a short period when he lived on the streets, and he had what passed for social services in Victorian London, which is to say, good luck. So he grew up with an absolute attitude of self-reliance. He cared not anything about what conventional society thought was civilized or what conventional society thought or cared about. He realized that his survival was going to depend on him and him alone. And so he was, there was no way to convince him otherwise, given the first 12 years of his life, 15 years of his life.
Well, mentioning his childhood, that's a great segue into my next question, because the movie does begin with Charlie Chaplin's childhood. And we learned quite a few things from the movie. We learned that money was very tight for them, as you had alluded to. His father was not in the picture. His mother didn't seem to do well on stage. We see her once on stage, but she mostly earns a living doing patchwork, like making gloves, try to put food on the table. We see Charlie's older brother, Sid, being sent off to a training ship. We don't really see that, but it's mentioned. And then Charlie was sent to a workhouse for a year. We also see Charlie's mother, Hannah, being committed to an asylum when Charlie is maybe 12 or so. The movie's a little vague on that timeline. But that's ultimately why the movie explains Charlie getting into vaudeville to try to earn money to get his mom into a better place. How well does the movie do setting up Charlie Chaplin's early years?
Reasonably well. It shortchanges Sid, his older brother, by 2 years. They were half brothers, theoretically. Charlie's mother and Sid's mother, they shared the mother. The fathers were different theoretically. Charlie's mother was adjudicated insane when Charlie was a child. She also had syphilis. We don't know. There's no way of telling whether the madness, her mental condition, derived from tertiary syphilis or whether it predated the syphilis. We just don't know. In other words, what was the extent of her emotional difficulties before the syphilis got a hold of her? But Sid was the only real center of gravity that Charlie had as a child. Sid's 2 years older. Nobody was ever 100% sure who Sid's father was. The lifestyle of the English music hall was, shall we say, sexually free and easy. And both of Charlie's parents grew up, were music hall performers. Charlie's father, Charles Chaplin Sr., their middle name was different. So Charlie Chaplin is not technically a junior, although they have the same first and last names, but a different middle name. Charlie's father was considerably successful, but he was an alcoholic and died before he was 40. Charlie's mother lived into her 60s, but she was mad. But Sid was the only person upon whom he could depend, essentially. It was Sid who took Charlie in hand when he came back from his training mission on the ship and found Charlie living on the streets. Their mother had gone insane and been adjudicated a ward of the state. Sid had saved up some money because Sid had decided he didn't want to be a sailor. He wanted to be in show business. And he'd saved up several dozen pounds, which was a fair amount of money at that point. We're talking about 1903 or so, 1902, 1903. Had saved up some money from his time on the ship and had determined to go into show business, which he did. Charlie had dabbled in show business when his father was still alive. His father had gotten him a job as a clog dancer with a group of child dancers called the Lancashire Lads, the 8 Lancashire Lads. So Charlie had stuck his toe in show business, in the English vaudeville. But he hadn't really, I don't think, thought about pursuing it as a lifestyle. But Sid became reasonably successful with the Fred Carno Company, which was the English comic vaudeville troupe. Carno had multiple, Carno was like a Broadway show had 6 road companies. Okay, like Hamilton has a road company in Chicago. They've got one in Palm Beach. They got all these road companies circling the world. That was what Carno's had. He had 5, 6, 7 acts, and they just toured all over England and the continent. And Sid got a job with Carno, and after a couple of years where Sid felt stable, he had asked Carno to take a look at his kid brother, Charlie. And Charlie was at this point about 18 and looked like a scared doe, and Carno basically took him on as a favor to Sid because he didn't think he had any particular ability. But he blossomed and he became the star of the Carno show, far outrunning Sid. But that was only the first of the mitzvahs that Sid did for his brother. Sid adored Charlie. Charlie adored Sid. They were always there for each other, and they could always depend on each other. And Sid was I think fair to say, a louche character. He was always trying to devise methods for outwitting income tax. He was hellacious with women, far more than his brother, actually. Charlie had the reputation, but Sid was really lethal. And not socially acceptable, particularly. Uh, uh, but none of that made any difference because Sid is always there for Charlie. And they were extremely loyal to each other until Sid's dying day. Sid died first on Charlie's birthday, actually, which I'm sure cast a pall over the day. But Sid barely appears in the movie, because Attenborough's only got so much time. So very important things like Sid's presence, like the bond between them, the way that Charlie could always count on Sid and Sid could also always count on Charlie, just doesn't appear.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned that it was Sid's father that helped him get into vaudeville. So the father was kind of in the picture a little bit, or was that just
Charlie's father helped get him? But then Charlie's father died at the age of 37. So Charlie was stuck with his mother, which was to say with nothing at all. Charlie adored his mother, worshipped her till his own dying day. But in any practical sense, she wasn't of much use. She had psychotic episodes. She had psychotic breaks. She would go into demented ravings. She would threaten people. Never her children. Never her two children. But she was you couldn't depend on her for anything. So Sid getting Charlie into the Carno troupe, into high-end English vaudeville, was his salvation, really, because it gave him a professional identity. It gave him a center. It gave him a place to earn money. And it also provided him the entree into movies.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of Carno, we do see that in the movie. And according to the movie, Charlie's act with Mr. Carno is he's a drunk guy falling all over the place. And it seems to be a hit with the audiences.
It was a huge hit. That's very factual. That was exactly, Charlie did a comic drama. That was his comic character. That was one of the Carno's stock playlets, as it were, where Charlie is a drunk and he breaks up a vaudeville house, vaudeville within vaudeville, destroys everybody else's act within this vaudeville premise, and it was a very successful show. It was very successful all over England. It was successful on the continent, and it was successful when they brought it to America.
Mm. So was that, because that was going to be my question, because that's how the movie shows his success in that show, being how he got to tour America with Carno. So that sounds like that's actually how he got to America then.
That is. Max Sennett caught Chaplin's act. Was it Philadelphia? It was someplace in the East. Chaplin spent 2 years basically touring America. And he adored America from the beginning. He went to Cleveland. He played Minneapolis. He played Butte, Montana. I mean, they covered, it wasn't just the big cities in the East. They covered small towns. They covered everything. And he made some friends along the way, Groucho Marx. And Groucho Marx saw Chaplin's act, the Carno act, and thought he was by far the greatest comedian he'd ever seen in his life. And Groucho Marx had been exposed to a lot of great comedians. Now, the Marx brothers are just starting out at this point. But Marx always said he was astonishingly funny. Everybody said Chaplin was astonishing on stage. And Marx would talk about that to his own dying day. The greatest comedian he ever saw was young Charlie Chaplin and middle-aged Charlie Chaplin and old Charlie Chaplin. But Chaplin was extremely successful when he came to America. And Max Sennett had seen that show called Night in English Music Hall, I believe in Philadelphia. And when he lost his star comic at the Keystone Company, he thought, well, that guy might be able to get work for me. And he offered Chaplin a contract, and there was a lot of back and forth because Chaplin was very security oriented, given his childhood. And there's 2 contracts that survive from Chaplin's year with Max Sennett and Keystone. The one, I think it's $150 a week, which is a good salary in 1913. But he could be cut loose with 2 weeks' notice at any point. And Chaplin didn't sign it. He held out for a full year contract, no cut contract. He didn't know if it was going to be good or not. But he wasn't gonna quit a sure thing like the Carno company to get fired 2 months later.
Right. The security was obviously a very important thing to him, which makes sense since explaining his childhood. That makes sense that the security is a.
Security was crucial. Yeah, financial security. He was very nervous about money for most of his life. Even when he was very wealthy, he was still a friend of his named Max Eastman. I quote Eastman in my book. Said that it wasn't that he was cheap; he was anxious about money. He was more conscious of the possibility of losing it than he was with the security that having millions of dollars gave him. You know, and that's a psychological thing, and it's not a logical thing. It's a psychological thing. And he was always a little nervous about money, even when he was very wealthy.
Yeah. Which, yeah, again, makes sense. I mean, that's one of those things that if you grow up in poverty like that, that's you probably you're going to have that your entire life.
It's like a suit of clothes. You're going to be wearing that the rest of your life to one degree or another. Very few poor people are carefree about money, even if they make a lot of it. It's always an issue. It's always going to be an issue. And that was certainly the case with Jeff.
So one of the things that we see in the movie, you mentioned with Butte, Montana, and in the movie it's Butte, Montana in 1913 when first is when he gets the letter from Max Sennett with the offer for $150 a week. But that also seems to be the first time that Charlie has ever even seen a movie, or the flickers as they call it in the movie. And he's fascinated by it. He just watches the same film over and over again. Was that when he was introduced to movies himself?
No, he wasn't really interested. He'd seen them, of course. Everybody had seen movies by 1912, 1913, especially if you're in the theater, because you're looking at your competition. Because the movies are already starting to leech audience away from vaudeville by that time. So he'd seen them, but he wasn't terribly impressed. He thought they were tacky, and because most of them were just one-reelers, 8 or 10 minutes. And he didn't think they were any competition, and he didn't think they were anything to worry about, and he wasn't terribly interested in them as an art form or going to work for them.
Okay. Yeah, that seems to be a little different.
Theater guy. He was very much a theater guy at this point.
Okay. One thing before in the movie, before he even leaves to come to America, he does meet Hetty Kelly for the first time, and almost instantaneously he asks her to marry him. She turns him down. She's like, "I'm only 16, and plus we don't even really know each other." But Charlie seems smitten. Did he fall for her as fast as the movie implies?
Yeah. In later life, he said, "I might have met her 4 times, maybe 6." But he said the word he used was fetish. It was a fetish. In other words, he was emotionally prepared to fall in love, and she happened to be standing there.
Oh, okay.
He was beginning to feel comfortable on the stage. He was making a living. He didn't have to worry about where his next meal was coming from anymore. Well, what's the next step? But what he doesn't really, he does refer to it, not so much in the film. It's not a factor in the film. It's a huge factor in his life. He was incredibly shy about women. There's a wonderful story in my book that Groucho Marx told. They're in Salt Lake City. The Marx Brothers are coming in. The Carno troupe is leaving. Sunday was the switch day because you didn't have performances on Sunday because of blue laws, because everybody was supposed to be in church, especially in Salt Lake City. So the Carno troupe's last performance was Saturday. The Marx Brothers' first performance was going to be on Monday. But so on Sunday, you did your laundry, you relaxed, you got a good meal, you caught the train for the next gig. That was Sunday in vaudeville life. So the Marx Brothers are in town, and they know Charlie from previous crossings, ships in the night things. And the Marx Brothers looking for a cat house. Now, I didn't even know there were any in Salt Lake City, but clearly there were. So the Marx Brothers invite Chaplin to come with them to the house of prostitution in Salt Lake City. Well, he's got nothing else to do. His train doesn't leave till that night. So they go to the house of prostitution. And Groucho told the story that the Marx Brothers immediately took girls and went in the back to do what they were going to do. Charlie was so shy that he stayed in the front of the house in the parlor playing with a dog, playing with the madam dog. He couldn't work up the courage to like choose a girl and take her in the back. The Marx Brothers went and did everything. He just waited for him in the front of the house. He said that was, now Charlie becomes famous in a couple of years. He doesn't have to ask anybody anymore. People ask him, women ask him. And that was like a huge set of doors opening for him because he was so painfully shy, possibly because that was his nature, possibly because of his background, and partially because he never really got over the idea that he was a poor child in London, psychologically. But he didn't pursue women so much. But the Hetty Kelly thing was what he called, his word was a fetish, that he barely knew her. But even in his old age, he still thought about her. He still thought about it because it was just one of those instantaneous things where you look and you think this most beautiful creature you've ever seen in life. And she was just, well, what are you talking about? Who are you? You want to marry me? What? When? Now? She was sensible. She died in the 1918 flu epidemic. And Chaplin employed her brother, whose name was Arthur Kelly, as his representative at United Artists for 30 years. I'm sure the fact that he was Hetty Kelly's brother had everything.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure that was not a coincidence.
No. So she meant a great deal to him on some deep psychological level that he probably couldn't even articulate. It went beyond the status of a teenage crush. It was more than a teenage crush.
In the movie, we see the creation of Charlie Chaplin's most famous character, the tramp. And the way the movie shows him coming up with the tramp, it almost seems accidental. Max Sennett is a director, and he tells Charlie to get changed one day. And he seems to be taking quite a bit of time to do that. But then Charlie comes out with the hat, suit, fake toothbrush, mustache that we all know now as the tramp character. And he takes so long in the wardrobe that Mac just starts shooting the film without him. And then Charlie bursts onto the set, and the whole film from then on out just seems to be improvised. Was that really how Charlie Chaplin came up with the tramp?
Yes and no. In his memoir, Chaplin was very specific about it. Sennett had seen him on stage, and Chaplin was made up as an old drunk on stage. He had on a mustache that added years to him, a kind of a handlebar mustache. He just looked older, and they put lines on his face to make him look like he was at least 40 or 50 years old. Chaplin's 24 years old at this point. So when he showed up at Sennett's studio, Sennett said, "You can't be that guy I saw in Philadelphia. You look, you're a kid." And Chaplin said, "I am that guy, So, but anyway, they wanted to put him to work, and Sennett said, "Just put on a funny makeup." Well, Chaplin wasn't going to put on the makeup he used at Carno because it made him look old. So he went to the prop room and he looked around, and there was Fatty Arbuckle's pants, and Chaplin was 5'6" and weighed about 130 pounds, maybe. And Fatty Arbuckle weighed about 250, 260. So the pants were huge. So he needed a belt, and the pants are huge and baggy. He put on a pair of shoes that were too big for him. And because the pants were so baggy, he just sort of thought, well, maybe a coat that's tight. It would do a contrast thing. The coat was too tight, Then he remembered that Sennett thought he looked too young. So what puts age on a guy's face? Facial hair. So then he pasted a little mustache on. A toothbrush mustache. And he put the bowler hat on, which was also sitting in the prop room. And it took probably a half hour. And it was all spur of the moment, an improvisation, essentially. The costume was an improvisation, and he went on the set. And no, they weren't already shooting, and he runs into the scene while the camera's writing. That's Richard Attenborough. But the costume's an improvisation, and Sennett's films were almost completely improvisations. They would make a movie off a one-page synopsis. There was no script what we could call script. It was just basically a couple paragraphs of where it starts and where it finishes, and how it was broken up into shots was the director's business, And it started, and the audience laughed. I mean, the crowd behind the camera laughed. And Sennett was not sure it was going to work. because you can't really judge. But when Chaplin's films started rolling out, the audience immediately responded, and the exhibitors wanted more prints because the demand grew very quickly, like a prairie fire. And instead of making 15 or 20 prints, they had to make 50 prints for a Chaplin, for instance. So he could tell that something was working with this character, with this comedian, to such an extent, although he couldn't hold on to it. It was a 1-year contract. And after 3 or 4 months, Chaplin started getting other offers. He said, "What kind of contract?" He said, "Well, your contract's up in 8 months. We'll talk to you then." And so he was making, as I said, to $175, I believe, because they negotiated up from $150, but $175 a week at Senate. And his next job a year later was for $1,500 a week, you know. And in 1915, that's a lot of money. That's serious money, because taxes were tiny, non-existent, really. So it's almost pure gross. Oh no, it's actually pure net, you know, because you're not really spending the overhead. His overhead was very low. And from then on, it was just a constant ascension until the 1940s, basically.
Well, it sounds similar to what the way that the movie shows him kind of catapulting into fame is because of the Tramp, but then the disconnect between Mack Sennett and Charlie Chaplin, according to the movie, is money. We see Sid coming to America to be Charlie's manager, and he asks for $1,000 a week. You mentioned $1,500 a week, and Mack just isn't having, according to the movie, Mack isn't having $1,000 a week because that's more than he's making. And so that's the reason why, according to the movie, Charlie cuts ties with Mack Sennett, and then he forms his own company with Bronco Billy Anderson. And then there's voiceover where Charlie is explaining that all the while he's saving up money for his own studio so that he can have full control. And then, of course, later on in the movie, we do see him opening up his own movie studio. Does the movie do a good job of showing the way that Charlie went from acting to then directing? We saw that Mack Sennett let him start directing some films as well, and then to finally owning his own studio.
Pretty good. Yeah, actually, they did a nice job of recreating what the atmosphere of early Hollywood is like, you know. And Chaplin's background basically impelled him to take control of his own life wherever it was possible, and because he didn't trust anybody else.
Yeah.
He didn't really trust anybody else. So when it becomes clear that this is not just a 9 days wonder, that he could actually make a career out of this, and that the public is enchanted with him and is willing, and there's a great deal of money drifting his direction, he begins to realize, and he seizes the means of production, as Karl Marx would say. Within a couple of weeks of working for Sennett, he's already agitating to direct. Literal couple of weeks. And that would never change. That would never change. He never really trusted anybody else to take control of his life. He would have to get in control of his life. He wouldn't find anybody he trusted absolutely until he married Una O'Neill in 1942 or 3. Her he trusted. Her he would never worry about. He trusted her judgment. He trusted her intellect. He became a slavishly devoted husband for the first time in his life. Until then, he had to be in control at all times.
Did he bring Sid on to be his manager like we see in the movie? Because you mentioned they trusted him. So did he trust him as his manager then?
He did act as his agent, basically, for a couple of years. And to keep Sid close, he would in the book, there are these cables back and forth. Sid, I need you. Sid would be in New York doing whatever Sid was doing in New York, and Charlie would be trying to turn out a film in L.A., and things weren't going well. And he said, here's my premise. I'm wearing the Tramp costume, and the Tramp does this, this, and this. Wire what you can. He wanted gags. He wanted Sid to come up with premises, gags, scenario, a rough scenario. And then a week later, he'd say, I need you here. He'd cable, I need you here. And Sid would always come. He would drop whatever he was doing, and show up in LA and help Charlie with whatever he needed help. Sid was like a psychological crutch, an emotional crutch. I think Chaplin could have done without Sid, and there were periods when Sid would be in Europe for 10 years at a time, because Sid relocated after 1931 to the south of France, and he lived there until the war came, till World War II came. Then he came back to America to get away from the war. After the war, he lived in Palm Springs for a while on a trailer, but then he went back to the south of France and stayed there till he died. But he always dropped everything to come help Charlie when Charlie needed help. And when Charlie started making The Great Dictator, his first sound film, he asked Sid to come over and help. And Sid did a lot. Sid was basically, he wasn't credited, but he was essentially acting as an associate producer. It was his idea to hire Jack Oakey to play Mussolini, the film's version of Mussolini, Benzino Napoloni. That was Sid's idea. And Sid was very good in gag meetings, and kept Charlie happy, kept Charlie bubbly, because Charlie could be moody and not bipolar, but he had down period. And Sid was more the happy vaudevillian.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it sounds like, just again, going back to Charlie's childhood, he needed somebody that he could rely on there. And even if Sid, no matter what he gave, like having that support system there was something that Charlie needed and relied on.
His presence, I think, made Charlie feel everything was going to be okay. And there are people in their lives like that. I mean, a lot of us have someone like that. Sometimes it's a wife, sometimes it's a husband. But there's people that you simply trust with your life, and that was what Sid was to Charlie.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you mentioned Una O'Neill, and before we talk about her more, there are some other wives that we see Charlie having in the movie. According to the movie, when he's 29, he marries Mildred Harris. She's 16 at the time. They get divorced after Charlie finds out that Mildred lied about being pregnant. And then before long, Charlie gets married to another underage girl named Lita Gray. We don't find out much else about her. The movie mentions that they had 2 kids together, and for whatever reason, Charlie hated her. And then the movie mentions Charlie's third wife, Paulette Goddard, who jokes around by saying that she's way too old for him. She's 21. His fourth and final wife, then you mentioned, is Una O'Neill. And the movie doesn't mention her being underage, but it does show her as being significantly younger than Charlie is.
He was, I think, 53. She was 18 with him.
Okay, that's significantly younger. So I get the impression that Charlie Chaplin liked younger women. Is that true?
Yeah, it's a motif. That's not to say he had exclusive taste for younger women. He had age-appropriate affairs as well, relationship with women too. Any number of actresses, Paula Negri, Marion Davies, and they were all, 27, 30, whatever. So it wasn't an exclusive thing where he would only was attracted to younger women, but younger women were clearly an attraction.
One of the things that I got from the movie is with Hetty Kelly and then Una O'Neill in the movie, they're played by the same actress. And so the impression I got was the movie was telling this idea of maybe Charlie is seeing Una as Hetty, as you mentioned, Hetty passed away in the flu epidemic. Did Charlie see some sort of similarity between Una and Hetty that we know of, or is that just a movie thing?
I think it was a movie thing. I don't see it. Looking at Hetty and looking at Una, I knew Charlie's son, Sidney, named after his brother. And Sidney loved his father. He was one of the children by Lita Gray, Charlie's second marriage. And Sidney adored Una. And he said, the thing about Una was she was extremely intelligent. And he said, in my mind's eye, she's always walking around with a Philip Roth novel. She was well-read. She was articulate. They had 8 kids together. But she was no vapid pinup. She had a brain. She was Eugene O'Neill's daughter, although Eugene O'Neill was a catastrophic father and not much of a human being for that. Una had two brothers. Both of them committed suicide. Both of Eugene O'Neill's sons were suicide. It's possible that Una escaped suicide because she married Charlie Chaplin, because each of them gave the other the completely responsive love that they've been searching for their entire lives. Because O'Neill was forbidding and judgmental, and Charlie was looking for someone to be like his mother, but not crazy. He wanted complete acceptance and complete love, and Una gave him that. And in return, he gave her the feeling of security and warmth and a place to come to that she'd never had because of her upbringing with her father.
It sounds like they had similar childhoods in that they were both looking for that security and giving that to each other.
Well, they both had deprived childhoods. Chaplin economically, Una psychologically and emotionally.
Another controversial part of Charlie's story that we see happening in the movie is centered around the political themes in his films. For example, in the movie, we see Charlie making a silent film where he shows an American immigration officer being kicked on the backside. That was during World War I. And it was something that we see J. Edgar Hoover criticizing Charlie's face before Hoover becomes director of the FBI. And then many years later, you mentioned just before World War II, Charlie making his first talkie, as they call it, where he's making fun of Adolf Hitler in the movie The Great Dictator. Does the movie do a good job of showing the political themes in Charlie Chaplin's movies?
Well, it's a kind of on a hit and run basis. I mean, Charlie, and there's no evidence that Chaplin and Hoover ever met, for one thing, let alone had an argument over a dinner table. That never happened. They may have met glancingly at some point with a handshake, but I mean, they never got involved. Hoover's antipathy was political and social. It wasn't based on anything personal.
Well, there was that side of kind of the political aspect, but then his first talkie in the movie, he's saying that the advent of sound is going to do away with the tramp, and so it seems kind of like there's more to him going into sound with the first talkie being The Great Dictator.
Right. Well, there's two parts to this. The tramp was recognized worldwide as a symbol of the underclass, basically. In Japan, he was taken as Japanese. In French, he was taken as French. In France, he was taken as French. He wasn't perceived as an American character.
Mm.
If Chaplin made a sound film with the tramp, the minute he opened his mouth, the tramp becomes English. Because Chaplin had a soft, attractive, but an English accent.
Sure.
And so the tramp's universality disappears in 5 seconds if it's a sound film, if he talks. So when sound rolls in at the end of the 1920s, he's got a real crisis of conscience. Now, he's a great actor. He's a superb actor. It's not that he couldn't play anything else. He eventually did. But he was comfortable with the character. The world was comfortable with the character. So he decided to face it down by surrounding the tramp with sound, but not have the tramp talk. So he composed the musical score. There's sound effects. There's car horns. The tramp's in the modern world, but we don't hear the tramp speaking. Okay. And everybody thought he was nuts because he's making 2 silent films, City Lights and Modern Times, years after sound rolls in and obliterates silent movies. And those 2 films are extremely successful. They're successful critically. They're successful commercially. So he's proven right. Once again, his absolute distrust of conventional wisdom can be ignored. Can ignore conventional wisdom. They don't know what they're talking about. But along comes Adolf Hitler. And this tickles every angry nerve ending in Chaplin's body. Because Hitler is a fascist. Chaplin is emotionally and psychologically and politically anti-fascist. And he knows an authoritarian when he sees one. Hitler's a raving anti-Semite. And they take Chaplin in Germany to be a Jew. He's not a Jew, but he refuses to acknowledge the fact that he's not a Jew because he feels that would be giving aid and comfort to anti-Semites. So he's determined to make this satire of Hitler. And everybody in Hollywood thinks he's insane. Everybody, because he starts shooting this movie in September 1939. And in America in 1939 is probably 65, 75% isolationist. That's Europe's problem. Hitler is Europe's problem. The Jews are Europe's problem. If Hitler takes over Europe, we'll just make a separate peace with him and we'll be fine. Pearl Harbor doesn't happen until December 1941, which drags us into the war. Up until that point, we're at arm's length from all that mishigas over in Europe. And here's Chaplin risking $1.5 million or so of his own money to make his first sound film that everybody in show business, including his brother, I might add, thinks is nuts. But again, Chaplin didn't care what other people thought. He just didn't. And he had one person telling him to go ahead and make the film, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He thought Chaplin making an anti-fascist satire might help turn some of the public to Roosevelt's own point of view, which was that Hitler was going to have to be fought at some point. There was no way we were going to get away from fighting Hitler. He had to be killed. So he sent word. He had Harry Hopkins, his right-hand man, come to the Chaplin studio and buck Chaplin up because the British Foreign Office didn't want the film made, and they told Chaplin that Germany's man in L.A., a man named Gissing, warned the Motion Picture Association that the Chaplin making movie could cause a great deal of problems for the motion picture industry in Europe. And at this point, I mean, you got to remember, Germany was not just Germany. There was fascism in Italy. The Germans had taken France. The Germans owned most of Europe outside of England at this point. So losing the 60 or 70% of the European market was no small thing to Hollywood, because that's where the profit was. You broke even in America, you made your profit in Europe. That was the rule of thumb, or vice versa. But you couldn't do without foreign revenue. And here Chaplin said, I don't care if they, and he had no guarantee that the film would be shown here, because the theater owners didn't want to get into it. He said, then I'll rent halls, I'll put up tents, I'll show the movie in tents, I'll do whatever it takes, And I don't doubt he would have done it. I have no doubt he would have done it, because he had the money and he was fired up. He was really fired up. And he made the film, and it was a huge hit. Everybody in Hollywood thought he was crazy. Everybody in Hollywood thought he was crazy. And it was another hit. And that gave him a huge wind at his back, because it was a sound film. He managed to integrate the Tramp, kind of. He made the Tramp a Jewish barber. And the Tramp basically talks in monosyllables until the end of the movie, where he makes a speech. But the Tramp doesn't really have much conversation. As Hitler, he could harangue the crowds in this wonderful vaudevillian gibberish, German gibberish, which is completely nonsensical, but it's funny, especially if you've ever seen photographs, movies of Hitler talking and ranting and raving. And the film's a huge hit. And it's a very good film even now, especially the parody of Hitler. But it put a lot of wind at Chaplin's back. And in retrospect, it probably gave him a feeling of being bulletproof when he actually wasn't. Nobody's bulletproof, right? And it did antagonize the far right wing in America to a great extent. And that would increase with his activities during the war, when he proselytized for opening up a second front to aid Russia, who are now our allies in the fight against Hitler. And the right wing in America didn't see Russia as our allies. They saw Russia as an enemy in waiting. And they didn't want to open a second front to aid Stalin in his fight against Hitler, because after all, Stalin and Hitler had signed a non-aggression pact before.
Right. Before the aggression. Yeah.
Before launching in yet another round of aggression. So you can't trust Stalin. Chaplin's point of view was, you might not be able to trust Stalin, but we've got to trust one party or the other in this, and we might as well back Stalin because Hitler is unthinkable. But the right saw this as tantamount to treason. And another factor was that Chaplin never became an American citizen. He'd always retained his British citizenship. And what Max Eastman pointed out, I think correctly, was that they misinterpreted the fact that if Chaplin had been born in America and gone to England and become rich and famous, he wouldn't have taken out British citizenship either. He didn't really believe in patriotism. He thought patriotism was the last refuge of a scoundrel. He thought patriotism was the basis of most wars. Look at Germany. And he didn't want any part of it. He didn't want any part of it. He was grateful to America. And as he always pointed out, I pay 100% of my taxes in America, even though only 70% of my income comes from America. The rest came from overseas. But he didn't see that this could be a problem. Because again, he didn't care what anybody else thought. And as I write in the book, this made his films much better. It complicated his life considerably.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see how that would be the case.
Right.
If we go back to the movie, in 1945, we see Charlie's career take a dive. He's taken to court by a woman named Joan Barry. And even though the blood test... 1943. But in court, the blood test proved that Charlie was not the father of Joan Barry's child, but he's still ordered to pay $75 a week in child support.
It was raised to about $140.
Was it? Okay. Well, we see a montage of clippings from the FBI, and this is in the movie, at least we talked about earlier, the conversation with Hoover and Chaplin, and it kind of gives the idea that Hoover's always keeping tabs on him. And we see the clippings in the movie go from talking to the Joan Barry case to tying Charlie Chaplin with communism, and then being married to Una O'Neill, much younger woman. And the impression I got from the movie is that all of these things kind of swirled together to tank Charlie Chaplin's public perception. And then in 1952, according to the movie, that there's a final straw, as something you just mentioned, where he takes vacation to London, but he's not, because he's not an American citizen. The movie is very vague in this, but we see Hoover smiling when he finds out they're out of the country. And then we see that Una tells Charlie that they've been kicked out of America. Can you give a little more explanation on the demise of Charlie's movie career?
Yes, he had two court cases in 1943, one after the other. First one was the Mann Act. He had a girlfriend named Joan Barry. She was 23, I believe. And she wanted to get in the movies. And they had a relationship that lasted a year and a half. She was very erratic. She was probably bipolar. And then she shows up pregnant. She asserted that Chaplin was the father of the child, naming the date of conception, which was, I think, 2 days before Christmas. And Chaplin knew that he wasn't the father because they hadn't had sex that day. So he was willing to take the blood test. And as I say in the book, if he knew they'd had sex, he wouldn't have volunteered to take the blood test. He would have tried to dodge it somehow. I mean, you don't hand them the rope that they're going to hang you with. Anyway, He was first tried for the Mann Act, violating the Mann Act, which was transporting a woman across state lines for immoral purposes. His lawyer was a brilliant magician named Jerry Giesler, who was the go-to guy in Hollywood whenever you were in water up to your chin. Errol Flynn's rape trial. Everybody got Giesler whenever a movie star was in deep trouble or you had a nasty divorce. And Giesler got the verdict was not guilty after a jury deliberated for an hour and a half because Giesler's defense was essentially, why would he transport her across state lines when he could have had her any place in California for the price of a car ride, of a taxi ride? So, not particularly flattering for the lady in question, but logically, okay. Yeah. So he was acquitted. Then came the paternity test about John Barry's child. Even though the blood test proved he was not the father, he lost the case. And the appeals courts in California wouldn't hear the appeal. They simply turned the appeal down. So he was obligated to pay child support till the child was 18 years old. And at this point, the child was about a year and a half old, year and a half, which graveled him no end, as it would anybody. But the combination of the open a second front for Russia during the war, the paternity suit, the Mann Act lawsuit, all conspired to basically cut the ground out from under him with the public, with the American public, to a great, great extent.
Hmm.
And then in 1947, he made his first film since The Great Dictator, 7 years before, Monsieur Verdoux, about a guy who marries women and bumps them off, obeying a Frenchman who is a Bluebeard, essentially. He marries a succession of obnoxious women and bumps them off for the money. And it's a social satire, and he's aiming for a kind of Shavian comedy of, the subtitle of the film is A Comedy of Murders. And he's aiming for a kind of George Bernard Shaw thing. And there was a great deal of controversy about it then. There was a great deal of controversy about it in the 60s when it was reissued right after Dr. Strangelove. It was completely rejected by audiences and critics in 1947. It was his first commercial flop, his first critical flop. He'd never had a flop.
Wow.
And at this point, he's 58, 59 years old. And it's a shot to the chops. You know, he thought, based on making silent movies in 1931 and 1936, based on his satire of Hitler, all of which were films that everybody told him, God, don't do this. Do not do this. And he succeeded. He probably thought there was an element of being bulletproof in his character. And out comes Monsieur Verdoux in 1947. But the context has changed. The context of World War II, the context of his two trials, the context of rising tide of anti-communism and McCarthyism in America at the end of the 1940s. The social fabric was completely altered around him. And he didn't understand that because he's got blinder vision, because he's Charlie Chaplin, because he's insulated. He's got his own studio on La Brea in Hollywood. He's got plenty of money. He's got a beautiful marriage and growing family. And he thought he could just continue on as before. And he So it was a huge blow psychologically, I'm sure. But he hunkered down. While all this is going on, the government is crawling all over him in every way possible. The IRS is going through years of income tax returns for him personally, for the studio. The INS is interviewing him about his support of Russia. Basically, there's all this groundwork being done to figure out a way to get him out of the country. Basically, the entire security apparatus of America is being devoted to railroading a motion picture comedian. All this comes to fruition in 1952. Now, the thing of it is, the Hollywood blacklist begins in 1947, the same year as Monsieur Verdoux. By this time, the FBI had informers within the Communist Party in Los Angeles, which was a legal party, I might add. It wasn't. They knew exactly who was in the Communist Party. That's why the Hollywood 10, the first people that were subpoenaed to appear before Congress, the reason they subpoenaed those 10 guys was because they knew they either had been in the party or they still were in the party as of 1947, as of the date of the hearings, because they had the lists of the membership roster. They knew Chaplin had never been a communist. They knew Chaplin had never donated a dime to the Communist Party. But it didn't matter. As far as they were concerned, he was still dangerous, politically dangerous, socially dangerous, a threat to womanhood. Who knows? He made a film called Limelight in 1952, a totally apolitical film, which is basically the story of Charlie and Una told through the prism of the Edwardian Music Hall. He plays an old, busted up, broken down music hall comedian who saves a young girl from suicide. She falls in love with him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Completely apolitical. It premieres in London. He takes his wife and children, and the Queen Elizabeth the Queen Elizabeth, from New York to London. 2 days out of New York, the INS rescinds his reentry.
Hmm.
Now, the ironic thing is that, as the documents in the FBI file prove, the INS knew that if he decided to come back, they couldn't keep him out. He'd never been convicted of a crime. And they really had nothing on him other than this kind of miasma of disreputability that descended on him during the war because of the Joan Barry case, because of his support for a second front. And they said, if he comes back, it can be it'll be a stink, but we're going to have to let him back in the country. But he never came back because he got his back up, and he was offended. And he said, "I'm never going back there." His problem was that everything he had in the world was in Los Angeles. His money, his stocks, his bonds, his cash, his studio, his films, his house, everything's in America. And he can't get back in without going through the process. And he wasn't going to go through the process. Luckily, Una was a citizen. So she came back and cleaned out everything, the safety deposit box. Sid was also here, and he took care of the studio. He cleaned up the studio and shipped the films. And to give you some idea of how determined Chaplin was to take control of his life again, this happened. He got kicked out of the country in September 1952. By January, he'd bought a house in Switzerland. Wow. He was very determined, clearly, psychologically, to take control of the situation. And he lived in that house of the Manoir de Ban, which is now at Chaplin Museum. He lived there for the rest of his life. And he only came back to America once to get his honorary Oscar in 1973. Then he said he was perfectly prepared to come back to America, and he's prepared to be shot. But nobody took a shot at him.
Yeah. Yeah, so it sounds like, I mean, because at the very end of the movie, we do see him coming back, and it almost, the way the movie portrays this, it seems almost like some sort of redemption for his career, because he does come back to the U.S. to accept the Special Academy Award. The movie, according to the movie, it's on his 83rd birthday, but he doesn't say. He ends up going back to his home in Switzerland. Does the movie do a pretty good job summarizing the end of his life then?
It's fair. It's fair. He made 2 more movies in Europe. He wrote a memoir, which is still in print. It's quite a good book, actually. Yeah. And he tended his family. You know, it was, and he had a series of small strokes towards the end of his life, which gradually enfeebled him. But yeah, it's fair. That's fairly accurate. But again, the film kind of hops from high point to high point to high point. Right. Without ever really developing a real rhythm of its own. I've always thought Kevin Kline is pretty good as Douglas Fairbanks. And Robert Downey is good as Chaplin, but Robert Downey is verbally funny. He's not physically funny as an actor. He's not, you don't think of Robert Downey and think, my God, so there are times when he's doing Chaplin's bits where I can almost see him counting the beats, you know, because he's memorized it through rehearsal, and he's okay, but it's not Chaplin.
Right.
Doesn't have that Quicksilver thing where Chaplin didn't have to count out the beats; he just did it. Right. You know. Right. You can see the difference between a trained physical comedian and someone who's imitating a trained physical comedian. They don't have the limberness that the natural.
Right. Right. You mentioned it throughout with your book. While you were working on your book, is there something there that didn't make its way into the movie that you wish had been included?
The relationship with Sid. I wasn't even completely aware of it until I started. The Chaplin estate gave me permission to rummage through their archives, and where you find these letters back and forth between it, especially after Chaplin's kicked out of the country. Sid is here trying to. And the thing about Chaplin was, one of his quirks was, he didn't write letters. He didn't write a lot of letters. You could not put a volume together of Chaplin's letters because he wrote maybe 150 in his life. He just didn't write letters. Partially, I think it's because he was badly educated. He didn't have much schooling, and he was worried about misspelling. Although his letters from Switzerland, the spelling's fine, you know. So, but Anyway, he just didn't write letters. And Sid is constantly saying, what do you want me to do about this? What do you want me to do about that? Talking about the hardware at the studio, the camera cranes, the music recording device, the this, the that. And he's writing Charlie, he said, I can sell this, or I can hold on to it, we could rent it. What do you want me to do? Silence. And it writes, he said, and then 3 weeks later, he writes Charlie another a slightly more irritated letter. How to let you know what you want me to do, He's trying to do his brother's bidding, but his brother won't tell him what his bidding is.
Yeah. Makes it hard.
And finally Chaplin writes him a letter, sell this, sell that. If I make another movie, I'll make it in London. I won't need the camera crane, sensible stuff. But he wouldn't tell Sid until Sid's like building a fire underneath him. But I wasn't aware of how intimate the relationship was and how Sid felt so aggrieved because Charlie wouldn't write letters until I really went through the documents, because Charlie didn't write about this in his own memoir. He talked about how much he loved Sid and how devoted they were, but he didn't go into chapter and verse, But when you see it, you realize the intense love they had for each other and how annoyed Sid could get because of Charlie's quirks. But he put up with them.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on to chat about Chaplin. Your brand new book we talked about has just been published. It's called Charlie Chaplin versus America. And I'll make sure to include a link to it in the show notes for this episode. But before I let you go, can you share an overview of your new book for listeners who want to learn more about the true story?
It's the story of Charlie Chaplin's life, basically from birth to his entering the film business to the FBI beginning to keep tabs on him in 1923, before J. Edgar Hoover even got to the FBI. That's when they opened their file on him. A dangerous radical that he was or wasn't. And it's kind of a social history of a comedian's life in 20th century America and what this one specific comedian had to go through and his boundless amount of courage and occasional foolhardiness in living his life.
Thank you again so much for your time, Scott.
Thank you, Dan.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. I'd like to thank Scott Eyman once again for sharing his time and expertise about the historical accuracy of Chaplin. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Scott's latest book dives into a lot more details about Charlie Chaplin than we could ever talk about today. So if you want to learn more about the true story, definitely go pick up a copy of Charlie Chaplin versus America, When Art, Sex, and Politics Collided. You'll find a link to it in the show notes for this episode, or you can always find it on the show's home on the web, basedonatruestorypodcast.com/283. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie again. Number 1, Charlie Chaplin was very nervous about money, even when he was wealthy. Number 2, Charlie's most famous character, the tramp, was the result of years of careful planning. Number 3, Charlie Chaplin never became an American citizen. Did you catch which one is a lie? Let's go in order. We'll start with number 1. Charlie Chaplin was very nervous about money, even when he was wealthy. That is true. Scott told us a lot about Chaplin's early life, how his family didn't have money growing up. His father died when Charlie was young, and his mother struggled to support Charlie and his brother Sid. So even after he made a lot of money, Charlie's relationship with money was basically the same as if he was a poor kid in the streets of London. That brings us to number 2. Charlie's most famous character, the tramp, was the result of years of careful planning. That's the lie. As Scott told us, the way Charlie came up with the tramp was very improvised and not something that he had spent years planning out ahead of time. But it was a hit and quickly elevated his career. That means number 3 is also true. Charlie Chaplin never became an American citizen. Scott explained to us that Chaplin kept his British citizenship, never became an American citizen, even though he lived and worked in the US for years. And that was something that was used against him when the US refused him re-entry later on in his life, leading to Chaplin eventually moving to Switzerland. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Now, before I let you go, I still have some Based on a True Story stickers. So if you want one, Shoot me an email at dan@basedonatruestorypodcast.com. While you're emailing me, why don't you let me know how you found out about the podcast? Did a friend share it with you? Did you do a search for the true story behind the movie Chaplin? I always love hearing how people find out about the show, so let me know. And don't forget, if you heard ads on today's episode, you can get rid of those by subscribing to the producer's feed, either in Apple Podcasts or on Patreon. Learn all about that over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/value, or use the link in the show notes. That's all for today. Until next time, thanks so much for listening, and I'll chat with you again really soon.